After all these years, the Sega Genesis is still going strong through the efforts of independent developers, and they've been able to push this hardware to the absolute limits. We've seen games that we never would have thought could have been possible back in the day. Let's talk about new Sega Genesis games with co-op. Now, the next handful of games I want to talk about are all unfinished. Some of them do have playable demos, and some of them just have gameplay trailers. But these are the upcoming games that I know of that have co-op. Aratu Brothers, I think that's how you say it. This is a side-scrolling action platformer, somewhat similar to Altered Beast or something like that. It's not quite a beat 'em up, but it has some of the same characteristics. And I believe this was made by a Brazilian developer. From what I played, I do enjoy the gameplay to some degree, but there ends up being a lot of enemies that just surround you, and it becomes pretty difficult pretty quickly. And also playing this with my 6-year-old daughter, it was kind of difficult to get through anything. She kept falling in the pits. The game is just pretty simple, and it gets repetitive pretty quickly. I do like the character designs, even though they're kind of ugly and weird. I just kind of like that. Ultimately, this one could use some more polish and more diversity, but it's not a bad game. The next game I wanted to mention is called Banana Cop, and I don't even know if this is still in development. There's no gameplay footage of it, just screenshots. This one was going to be released by Megacat Studios. All I can say is that it's a side-scrolling beat-em-up that has 2-player co-op. I don't know much more about it. I would like to see this game get released, so hopefully that still happens. Black Jewel Reborn. This is another side-scrolling action platformer, with a little bit of Golden Axe mixed in. I really like the music here. The level design is simple, but visually it looks nice. The combat feels solid, and the platforming feels like you're always in control when you do those jumps. The demo only has one level and a boss fight, so there's not a lot here yet. But this is one that I have had my eye on for a while, so I'm really looking forward to it. They're also doing a version on the NES. Cyber Mission is a game that has already been released on some modern platforms, including Steam, but it's in development to be ported to the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. This one definitely is inspired by Forgotten World. It's a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up where you play as these two muscly dudes, you fly around, and you also have turrets. It plays almost just like Forgotten Worlds. Visually, the game is pretty simple, but there is some very nice parallax scrolling going on. Overall, I'm definitely looking forward to this one. I enjoyed the demo. I've had this in my Steam library for a while, so I definitely need to go back and try it out. Lethal Wedding is another one that was being released by Megacat Studios. The demo's been out for quite a while, so I don't know if the game is still in development, but this is one that I would really like to see get released as well. It's a top-down shooter where you play as 2 female protagonists. One of them is the bride for the titular wedding. This one could use a little bit more polish as your weapons just don't feel very effective, and it takes a little bit too much to destroy some of the most basic enemies, and then they just keep respawning, so that part's a little bit annoying. I couldn't quite figure out what the objective is here. I spent a lot of time just wandering around. First I tried to destroy all the enemies, but then they just kept coming, so then I tried to avoid the enemies and move around, and then I just kinda got lost. But with some more polish, I think this one could be really cool. I do like the character designs quite a bit. Shaolin Carcará. I believe this one was made by the same team that did Aratu Brothers. And this one is another side-scrolling action platformer. But this one feels a lot more polished than the other game. It has some really nice fluid animations. Look at the character's clothing move, and when you do your kicks, it's just very smooth. That's impressive to see. I love the level design, and visually it looks really nice as well. Some really great use of color here. And this demo only has a few short levels as well, but I could see this one turning into something really cool. Shrine Maiden Shizuka. This one is a Metroidvania, and it has a really cool assist mode where a second player can push start at any time and join in as this little frog character. He's able to shoot projectiles, which is very helpful. I love the visuals here. It's very cartoony and colorful. I absolutely love the soundtrack for this first part that I played. We don't see enough Metroidvanias on the Sega Genesis, and we definitely don't see enough co-op Metroidvanias, so this is one that I was really excited about. There hasn't been any new updates though in a few years, so I really don't know what the status of this one is, but from what I played, I really liked it. It feels very polished, except for it did crash on us while we were playing it, so there is that problem. But ultimately, the gameplay in and of itself feels solid. Viking and the Ninja. This is an upcoming action RPG, stated to be influenced by Secret of Mana, which is definitely something missing from the Sega Genesis library. Action RPGs with co-op are definitely some of my favorite games ever. The visuals here are pretty simple, so I'd like to see a little bit more creativity there. There's no demo for this yet, but it is in active development. And from what I've seen from the gameplay, this definitely looks like it would be right up my alley. Zabu is another 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up. This one is definitely in early development. I like the character design mostly, and the brief amount of time that I played the demo, the combat feels good enough. It could use some more polish, but after only playing the game for about 1 minute, this happened. So I can't say too much more about the game. Hopefully they keep working on it. Now I want to talk about some upcoming ports that are being developed for the Sega Genesis. The first few I want to talk about don't have any playable demos yet. First, we have Cadillacs and Dinosaurs. This is going to be a port of the arcade game, and it's just impressive to see for this console. So far, I haven't seen any co-op gameplay whatsoever, so hopefully that does get implemented. But I still wanted to mention this game, as that's one of the standout features was the 3-player co-op. So it's got to at least have 2-player. Otherwise, what are we doing? And the next port I want to talk about is Metal Slug. Again, this one doesn't have any co-op in it from what I've seen so far, but this is really impressive to see on this hardware. Another really impressive project is the Simpsons Arcade game. It's a pretty faithful recreation of the arcade experience. It looks really colorful, it looks just like the cartoon and the arcade game. And I do believe this one will at least have a 2-player option. Most likely not 3-player or 4-player, as that's probably going to be pushing things a little bit too far for the hardware. Outside of the MS-DOS and the Commodore 64 versions, we never got a home release of this game. So it would be cool to see something a little bit more faithful to the arcade experience. We also have a version of Captain Commando that's being developed. The gameplay I've seen of this, it's in very early stages, so we'll see how this one turns out. There are 2 other ports that have some playable demos, and these ones are really impressive. The first one is Final Fight. It's not the full game, but it's got the first few levels. Back in the day, the Sega CD version was the closest thing to the arcade experience on a home console. It also had that great CD quality soundtrack. But seeing this on a base Sega Genesis is just really cool. Visually, the colors are a little bit more bland, and there is a lot of slowdown that happens. But it is still in development, so I imagine a lot of these things will be ironed out, and there will probably be a lot more polish. But it's just cool to see this even happening. The next one is one of my all-time favorite games that came out on the Super Nintendo, and that's Goof Troop. So far, the demo only has 1 playable level, but it is a very accurate recreation of the first level of the Super Nintendo game. It has the same really nice visuals, the colors are pretty accurate, but with the more limited Sega Genesis color palette, and the music sounds pretty good too. But it does slow down quite a bit at times. One addition that I noticed though is that there's a new weapon that you can use, and it's like a plunger gun, similar to the one in Quackshot. I'm not really sure why this was added though, as it doesn't really do anything new. It seems to just freeze the enemies, which is basically what the rope gun does anyways, so I don't really know why this was added, but it's cool to see nonetheless. Maybe it'll be implemented a little bit better in future levels. But one of the coolest things about this port is at the title screen, you actually hear a full version of the Goof Troop theme song, but it's in Portuguese. This just really surprised me to hear on Sega Genesis. This is just really funny and it's just cool. I would love to see this full game get ported to the Genesis. As I said, it's just one of my favorite co-op games of all time. Now I want to talk about some games that were developed for the Genesis back in the day, but were never fully released until recently. Oh, and all of these games are beat 'em ups. That wasn't planned, that's just how it turned out. The first one is Generals of the Yang family. This is a bootleg that originally came out in 1993 in Taiwan, and then it was more recently released by Pico Interactive. This one's just not very good. The graphics are okay, but ultimately it's a very stiff experience and the hit detection's not great. I would not recommend this game. Another prototype that was just recently discovered is called Out of the Vortex. Apparently this one was supposed to come out in 1995. This one's a side-scrolling beat-em-up with superhero-type characters. This one is in very early development, so there's not really any sound effects or music, and the game crashed on us pretty early, so I can't say too much about this, but I still wanted to mention it. And then we had the prototype for Stone Protectors that was originally developed back in 1994. This game did get released for the Super Nintendo. Yeah, this is pretty similar to that game. It's nothing special. It's just a very mediocre beat 'em up. I do like all the character designs. You have all these trolls. That's cool to see. And I do like the visuals, but the gameplay is just very lacking. You don't have enough moves, and the combat never feels satisfying. Feel free to just skip over this one. Another one by Pico Interactive, which was originally released in 1996, also in Taiwan, as a bootleg, is Water Margin. Out of the games I just mentioned, this one is definitely the best, but it's still not an amazing beat 'em up. It's just better than those ones. But I do really like the visuals and the color here. The characters and everything, they all look really great. This one plays kind of like a Golden Axe type of game. You even have screen clearing magical spells. I think this one's definitely worth trying out, but it is not one of the best beat 'em ups on the console. Now these are the games that actually had full releases and are brand new games on the Sega Genesis. This one's called Astrebros. This is a really great game, and it's the prequel to Demons of Asterborg, which is another excellent Sega Genesis homebrew. But this one is a co-op game. It's a 2D side-scroller roguelite with procedurally generated levels. You're able to choose between 3 different characters, each with their own unique abilities. As you play through the levels, you're able to collect coins to buy and upgrade your equipment. Gameplay here is just really solid and polished. There's just so much attention to detail. Just look at the backgrounds, the environments, the enemies, and the character designs. This is all just top-notch game design here. If you haven't played Astrebros, definitely give it a shot. It's one of the best co-op homebrews on the Sega Genesis. And then we have Coffee Crisis. This one is a 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up. Overall, I like the premise here. The story is interesting and kind of funny, but the gameplay is just loose and a bit sloppy. Even though the characters have some nice animations, they just kind of flop when they're fighting, and it never feels satisfying when you make contact. The hit detection isn't very good, and you just don't have a lot of moves here. You're able to do your standard punch, and you can jump and do a kick. You're also able to hold the button in to do a charging attack, and then if you push A and B, you do your desperation move. None of these really are that effective, to be honest. Also, a lot of the sound effects are just really quiet, so that also takes away from the impact. From the appearance, this one really did look promising, but ultimately I just can't recommend it. It's not a great beat 'em up. Handy Harvey is, I think, an homage to the fictional game Fix-It Felix from Wreck-It Ralph. It plays like a classic 80s single-screen arcade game, and you can play it 2-player. The premise is pretty simple. The enemy breaks the windows, you go up, and you each have to hold in the button to fix each window. And then you climb up the gutter, go to the next level, and fix all of those windows. Once you fix all the windows, then you move on to the next level. It's pretty basic, and there's not really a whole lot of depth when it comes to the gameplay. But that's kind of what you'd expect from an arcade game from the 80s. Overall, they definitely do a good job of making a tribute to the games of that era. And the game it does feel pretty polished. So if you are a fan of single-screen arcade games, I would recommend this one. Hunter Girls is an endless runner platforming game. You start out with one character, and basically you just run, you avoid the enemies, and jump over the pits. The further you get along, you recruit more characters, and you get up to 3. I like the art style here. It's very colorful. But the thing that is lacking is the 2-player support. It claims to be a 2-player game, but what it really means is you can control all of the movement of the characters with both controllers. So it doesn't really even feel like a cooperative game. It would have been better if one player controlled the movement of each character, splitting up the tasks between players. So I guess if you communicate, you can make that work, but you gotta be really careful, because when I was playing this with my daughter, we both just kept trying to jump at the same time, and it really screwed up the timing of things. Overall, I would recommend this game, just not as a co-op game. Papi Commando. It's a top-down shooter, like Commando. You play as Papi and Mammy, or Mommy, I don't know. You're able to get upgrades between levels, but you lose them if you die. The visuals and the music, they're not very great. The gameplay is pretty simple, and it gets boring quickly. Outside of shooting, you do have a knife, but you have to get very close to the enemies, and it sucks. Each level you have an objective, which usually involves just eliminating all of the enemies. There's also an overworld map like Mario 3. One thing I did like about this game is that if your partner dies, you can go up and revive them. So that adds to the co-op gameplay. When it comes down to it, the gameplay is just not entertaining enough to make me ever want to play this game again. But one of the best homebrews of all time on any console is Paprium. Despite all the controversy around the release of this game, let's put that aside and just focus on the game itself. It's just a really great, polished game. One of my favorite modern beat-em-ups. I specifically want to just talk about the visuals for a second. I love the color palette here. It has this really nice pastel look. There's so much attention to detail when it comes to the environment and the enemies. For instance, in this section, there's swinging doors. If you punch them, they swing open and closed, or if you throw an enemy to them. That's just a small little detail. Another thing that I noticed was that you'll see these TVs that are playing ads, and you can kind of hear a jingle playing in the background, and then if you smash the TV, it disappears. This is just stuff that they didn't have to do, but they did, and it just adds to the bigger picture of a really great, polished experience. Also, the gameplay is just really solid. The combat feels good. You're able to dash, which I think is an underrated feature in a beat-em-up game. And you have your special attack. When you push A, you go into like a turbo mode. You're able to inflict a little bit more damage towards the enemies. This game also has branching paths, so every time you play it, you can have a different experience. It's definitely worth trying multiple times. And we can't forget about the soundtrack. This game has a really great soundtrack. This doesn't even sound like something coming from the Sega Genesis. I don't know what extra enhancements they had in the cartridge for Paprium, but it's still just impressive to see this on an original Sega Genesis. And while I'm talking about the hardware, yeah, this is the only way you can play this game right now. You have to own the physical cartridge of Paprium and play it on an original Sega Genesis. You still can't emulate this game, and it hasn't been ported to any modern platforms. So that's pretty unfortunate. I was lucky enough to pre-order this game back in the day and had to wait multiple years before I actually got it. But hopefully someday we get this game ported to Steam and all of the modern platforms, so everyone can at least experience this game. I can't say enough about Paprium. It's just a really excellent co-op beat 'em up. It's truly the best homebrew on the Genesis. One of the games I wanted to mention that I haven't been able to play is War in the Machine. From what I understand, there is a 2-player co-op mode, and this one plays a lot like Herzog Zwei, which means it's kind of like a space shooter mixed with a strategy game. Unfortunately, this was only released physically, and the first release only had 30 copies, and then they did a second run, and that only had 15 copies. And from what I understand, the game has never been dumped, so there is no ROM available online. If anyone does find this ROM, let me know, because I do want to try this game. And I like the concept here. It looks fun. I just don't know what else to say about it because I haven't played it. So let me know if you are one of the 45 people that owns a copy of this game. I want to know more about it. Another top-tier homebrew is Xeno Crisis. This game has been ported to a number of other retro systems, but it first came out on the Sega Genesis. And much like Paprium, this is another one that is just incredibly impressive to see on this hardware. Not only the visuals, but the music. This is some of my favorite music I've ever heard on the Sega Genesis. But also it has some of the most clear voice samples I've ever heard on any 16-bit console.
Xeno Crisis.
That's just very impressive to hear. This is a top-down shooter. The best way to describe it is it's a mix between Smash TV and Aliens. There are several different control schemes that you can use, but I like to use the twin stick option. So if you have a 6-button Sega Genesis controller, you can kind of use A, B, X, and Y, and think of it like a triangle. The D-pad will move you around, and that triangle formation will do the aiming. If you can wrap your head around it, it works really well. But I don't know, every time I play this game, I have a hard time with the controls. I have never been able to beat it. I've only been able to get to the boss on the 4th level, and then I always die there. But I do love this game. It has been ported to modern platforms. It's also on the Sega Dreamcast, the Nintendo 64, the Super Nintendo, the GameCube, and I think they're working on a Game Boy Advance port. So there are numerous ways of playing this game now. I highly recommend you try this game out. So there you have it. There are a bunch of new and upcoming and unreleased Sega Genesis games with co-op. What are some that we missed? And if you enjoyed this video, you should check out our video where we talked about the top 30 co-op Sega Genesis games. And thank you for watching.